Okay, so this is what we are here to look at. I did, as I wrote this very slide, think that that's probably a very ambitious agenda for 45 minutes. So I have focused on things that are most useful and interesting, I hope. And I don't want to put myself forward as an expert on this topic either, but the more I read, the more fascinating it becomes. So we'll start at the beginning with this definition of imposter syndrome, going back to the 1970s when Clance and Imes looked at the concept of the imposter syndrome. So it's very much feelings of inadequacy that persist despite evident success. So imposters tend to suffer from chronic self-doubt. So not fleeting moments of self-doubt, but very much chronic self-doubt that kind of overplay any success that they might have. And it leads them to a sense of feeling like a fraud. This idea that you're going to be found out at some point because your success is not down to your capabilities or your performance, but it's actually just down to luck and therefore at some point someone will find you out. So that means that it does tend to impact on high achieving and highly successful people more, although it doesn't necessarily equate with low self-esteem or low confidence. So already you can start to see that the idea of imposter syndrome is itself quite nuanced. It's the feeling, really what we're going for is this pervasive feeling of self-doubt. And there's this idea that it is a syndrome. Well, actually, that is one of the many myths that surround the imposter syndrome. And that's where I'm going to start, actually. Let's look at a few more of the myths and misconceptions around this particular condition, okay? And if you've got questions as we go through, please do pop them into chat and we'll see how we get on with responding to those as we go through, or if not, I'm going to hope to put some time aside at the end. So actually, imposter syndrome in the 1970s, when it was first looked at, wasn't actually a syndrome. It was a phenomenon. So Clance and Imes talked about the imposter phenomenon, which I think in itself is actually really interesting because there has been a shift from this idea of phenomenon to this idea of syndrome. And it's really interesting for us, I think, to consider why that shift has occurred. I'd just like you, first of all, to think about that word syndrome to begin with, and what that conjures up to you when opposed to the word phenomenon. So I'm kind of thinking that when I think about a syndrome, I think about something that is an illness, a condition, a problem that somebody has. When I think about a phenomenon, I think about something that is interesting, a matter for curiosity, and exists in the broader sense, okay, which I find absolutely fascinating. And when you can do loads of feminist research around imposter syndrome and this idea that it has become a syndrome, particularly because it applies to high achieving women, okay, and particularly because the idea then that actually there's something wrong with women who are in this category, who are high achievers but have this pervasive sense of self-doubt and a worry that they are going to be found out to be frauds. So it becomes something that is almost a bit conjuring up that sort of crazy woman in the attic trope. There's something wrong with you, okay? And actually, I don't think that was what it was intended to be at all. Clance and Imes' study was on women, high achieving women, but not at any point was it a syndrome that was actually targeted solely at women. Okay, so there we go. So a syndrome then that potentially only impacts on high achieving women, that's our first myth. The study was looking at high achieving women, but actually more up-to-date understanding of imposter phenomenon is that actually men get it as well. it just shows up quite differently in men. So there's common characteristics, like being judged by other people is common to both, but how we show it is different depending on our gender. Okay, so that is the second myth. The same as doubting yourself. So it's not the same as doubting yourself. Actually, I always think that doubting yourself is a particularly human characteristic. If we didn't doubt ourselves, then we would probably be pretty arrogant as individuals, and we would probably be having not great levels of self-awareness as leaders. So actually self-doubt is a perfectly natural thing to have. And particularly if it's something that you care about. Okay, so if something's important to you, it's natural that you're going to worry whether you're going to get it right or wrong, or whether you're going to let people down. Okay, so we've got that pervasive thing that's coming in and that fraudulent thing that's happening, not the same as doubting yourself. It's also not the same as social anxiety, although it can be exacerbated by social anxiety, or also imposter syndrome. So social anxiety can also be coupled with imposter syndrome as well, but they're not the same thing, okay? And that's actually common to quite a lot of mental health conditions as well. There's quite a correlation, but it's not the same thing, okay? So we do need to understand it quite particularly. The second two, it's your fault when you have it. That kind of links to the syndrome. This is this idea that it's all to do with what goes on inside our head, okay, and the way we're thinking about ourselves. So therefore it's something that we need to fix with ourselves. Plenty more on that as we go through the session. But that is a misconception or a myth. And also a lot of work done recently around imposter phenomenon and unconscious bias, or even conscious bias actually, leads us to think as to whether it's caused by oppression. Definitely links, but again, not caused by. So there we are. So absolutely fascinating subject. And plenty to look at as we go through. I wanted to give you some practical stuff though, as well as sort of talking about what the research shows. But I do think it's a really necessary topic to understand the research, because we start to realize that some of the stuff we think we know isn't necessarily true. We can't take it on if we don't understand it. So how does it look different in men and women? Okay, so what imposter syndrome tends to show up in men more as avoiding certain situations where they might be unfavorably compared to other people. So they tend to avoid competition. They tend to show up in situations where there's less risk and less risk of them being able to fail. And that often means them not taking quite as many challenging career paths. So there's definitely an avoidance thing going on when it shows up in men. And where it shows up in women is much more around performance and feelings. So and performance anxiety, feeling that you're not good enough despite evidence to the contrary, having that kind of anxiety or guilt about your performance, and characterized by either overworking or procrastinating for long periods of time and then having a very short burst of activity at the end. Okay, so if you're interested in looking at this further, then it really links closely, I think, with Brené Brown's work around shame in terms of men and women, because she saw very distinct ways in which that shows up. For men, it's all about being strong, okay, and for women, it's all about being perfect. And I think you can see some really obvious alignments with those two different interpretations and experiences of imposter phenomenon. Some of you saying in chat that you really resonate with some of that, and I do as well, absolutely. So let's move on, okay, to having a look at understanding your own imposter syndrome. So for me, this is the starting point really of being able to take it on, is being able to understand how it shows up. What we know with anything to do with leadership or personal effectiveness is that self-awareness is always the starting point. So really understanding things so that we can then know what it is that we need to do about it, okay? So I just thought it'd be worth asking a few of these questions of yourselves. So when does it show up for you, this imposter phenomenon? Okay. And even it may even be asking yourself at this point in time, do I even have imposter phenomenon, or actually do I just have healthy levels of self-doubt? Okay. But if you do feel like you do suffer from this at points in time, or you have done in points in your career, or you may work with people who you see this playing out with as well and might want to support them, it's when does it show up? Okay. What makes it worse? What makes it better? And what's the relationship between it and your general mental health? And I'll come on to the last two questions in a minute. So I'll just give you some examples. When does it show up? So for me, this was a really interesting question, because actually sometimes I've thought I've had imposter phenomenon. And actually, I think in comparison, it might just be healthy self-doubt. So, for example, if I am going to do a conference, I'm going to stand up in front of a large group of people, I do start to doubt my own abilities. Okay. And I start to doubt whether I've got anything of value to say to them. And, but actually, I think that probably is quite understandable. That's probably an understandable level of self-doubt. And I can pretty much talk myself around from that fairly quickly. So there isn't that pervasiveness there. For me, actually, there's a link with my mental health, this imposter phenomenon thing, which is actually more around burnout. So when I'm feeling particularly tired and that's been going on for a long period of time, that's when I start to question my actual authenticity around the leadership piece. So I start to question whether I really I'm not just a bit of a fraud, turning up thinking that I'm, delivering sessions on leadership effectiveness and developing leaders, when actually myself, I'm not feeling it. I'm feeling quite detachment to my own work. And I'm not feeling that sense of love that I used to. And actually, we know now know that is a really common experience of burnout. Okay, so for me, what it shows up when I'm in that place, it shows up as something that's a nagging voice at the back of my head rather than something that's crippling. Okay, or and it relates to my mental health because it comes along when my general levels of resilience are quite low and I feel like I'm experiencing that burnout. What makes it better? Well, I've also found out that a very good holiday makes it better. Rather than the sort of talking myself round, I actually need to replenish my energy levels, and then I start to feel differently, I start to act differently, and then I can start to change that script, and I have the capacity to do that. Okay, so yeah, just wondering how that shows up for you. Just give that some thought, and if anyone would like to unmute and share, then please do so. I can see lots of things coming into chat, which is fantastic. Thank you. If anyone would like to unmute, then please feel free.
Is it okay if I come in on that?
Please do, yes.
Oh, it's just something that happened to me quite a few years ago that I was given, so trying to cut a very long story short, I was given a temporary promotion which lasted for 4 years, and then it got taken off me and regraded. So ever since then, I've been stuck where I am because it's like I was found out.
Absolutely, that's your story. That's your script.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. So it can often be a single incident that really triggers that particular imposter phenomenon. And really interesting that you talk about the voice, that thing in your head that ever since then it's been proof of that potential story about yourself that's been niggling away at you for a while. Okay. Thank you. And that may well resonate with lots of you. The interesting thing about imposter phenomenon is we don't always like to talk about it, not personally. Okay, we'll talk about the general concept of it, but actually personally, it's quite uncomfortable to admit. And when it's uncomfortable, it's sort of something we try to avoid, that we try to move away from rather than trying to move towards. So this idea of really understanding your own imposter phenomenon is quite important. You've got to lean into it and really understand where it's coming from, so that you can then kind of go, oh, interesting that I should think and feel like that. Let me have a look at what I could do with that, and how objective and how honest am I being with myself. And before we move on to that, though, I just wanted to look at the last two questions, because this is the bigger context, isn't it? And I always think imposter phenomenon, when you look at some of the outcomes around performance, actually does work for people in some ways. And I always believe as individuals that we tend to make choices based on what works for us at that particular point in time. I mean, humans are not stupid. We do things for a reason. And there's definitely elements of imposter phenomenon that work for us. So the idea of overworking, to a certain extent, overworking feeds overachieving, even if it doesn't change the voice in your head, it still has some kind of positive outcome. Okay. I often think that if I didn't have that voice in my head telling me that I've got to stop procrastinating because otherwise I'm really going to be found out, then I would probably just procrastinate forever. So on some level, it's probably working for you, and it'd be interesting for you to be curious about that as well, without forgetting about what it's costing you. Okay, because there is obviously a real cost to this, particularly as professional women who are in charge of our own careers and our own destinies. Okay, so I'm going to move on. So what can we do then about imposter phenomenon? What if we recognize that we do have it, or that we have it sometimes? Okay, and a lot of the tips really that you will read about, and a lot are based around kind of changing your thinking about yourself. Okay, and I would absolutely advocate this as a really good starting point. So first of all, really recognizing what the activating situations or the triggers are for you, recognizing that there may well be quite a lot of difference in how that shows up, and we've got that gender difference as well. So rather than thinking this is a blanket thing for us, which scenarios does it show up in? Then we want to sort of step back and try to understand how we're thinking about ourselves or about this situation. So really tune into some of those beliefs around being a fraud, some of those beliefs around our own performance and how we see ourselves, and then identify with how that is making us feel and how that is making us act. So whether it's making us procrastinate and then overperform, or whether that's making us work twice or three times as hard as other colleagues, and the impact that that is having on our wider mental health and well-being. Okay, the idea here is that we tune in to the beliefs and we start to question how objective and realistic they are. And obviously with imposter phenomenon, they're not, because the evidence shows the opposite of what you're believing about yourself. So it's about getting some other validation and some other evidence and being able to answer and almost argue that voice in your head. Okay. Now, I reckon most of you have probably done that to a certain extent. You probably do that. And for some of you, it probably works. For some of you, it probably works sometimes. For others of you, it probably doesn't actually make any difference to the consequences, how you feel and how you show up. And that's really understandable, because as human beings, we have certain habitual behaviors that are really, really ingrained, and certain habitual ways of thinking about ourselves that are really, really ingrained. So just changing the script, it's not something that's going to fundamentally change our self-identity straight away. That said, if we do it regularly, we can change the way we are talking to ourselves, and we can change the consequences. Another way of slightly looking at this, though, is that actually, this idea of confidence, maybe we want to feel more confident, maybe we want to feel like we've got greater self-worth. Actually, they are just feelings, okay? And actually, they're not what we do, and they're not what defines us either. So we might want to take a slightly different path and kind of go down a route which has its basis in acceptance and commitment therapy. Okay, this particular approach here, ABCs, has its roots in cognitive behavioral therapy. But this one here is more based on work from ACT, or acceptance and commitment therapy. So there's loads more to ACT than this, but I'm just trying to share with you a couple of takeaways really that you could potentially do when you recognize that you are in the grip of that imposter phenomenon. So the first thing is to just calm down a little bit, just slow your breathing. We know that when our physiology tells our brain that all is well, then our brain is calmer, okay? And we are able to be more clear-headed. And the best way to tell our brain all is well is to slow our breathing and to move out of that fight, flight, or freeze response, okay? The next thing is to really take note and to open up. So lean into that discomfort and be curious about your imposter syndrome, okay? So sometimes in ACT, we even say things like, thank you for brain for telling me that I am a fraud, that I might be found out in this moment. I appreciate that because you can see that this matters to me, okay? The second, so that's the acceptance part. It's not about trying to change the way you feel. There's nothing wrong with feeling like that. Actually, it's you, and it's perfectly natural that sometimes that self-doubt can show up as being quite crippling, okay? The commitment part of ACT is all about your sense of purpose and all about your values, okay? So it's really about tapping into your intrinsic motivation, the things that really matter to you, and asking yourself, how would I like to act in this moment so I can look back and be proud of myself? Why does this matter to me, and what do I want to do here? You could ask, how will I behave in line with my values? Okay. And the intrinsic motivation piece is quite important with imposter phenomenon as well, because obviously imposter phenomenon comes from worrying about what other people think about you, external motivation, and this changes that focus onto that intrinsic or internal motivation. So hopefully that would be useful for some of you to see, and some of you to apply, okay? And as with all of these things, human behavior, it's not like flicking a switch, is it? It may be that you want to work with somebody else, like a coach, to be able to really embed those things and better understand yourself and how those might work. When you do the pursue your values, it's going to be really difficult. Make no mistake, you're going to be having your brain and your body telling you no, and you're going to have to push through a significant amount of discomfort. And in doing that, I think there's another important part that we have to take on board, which is closing the loop. Okay, so when we do actually push through, then we need to recognize that we've done it. Okay, that we did this despite of how we felt, despite of our imposter phenomenon, and that we stuck with it. Okay, we also need to take note of the journey we went through, celebrate that, be pleased with ourselves, and in doing that, we have the potential to change the script. So ACT is not all about changing the way we see ourselves and having a different script, but actually by by living a life that is really well aligned with your values and recognizing that you're doing that, you kind of get a lovely byproduct of it doing just that anyway. I think I just glancing at the chat as well, the idea of keeping a log is really important, because this stuff you can miss so quickly. So really embedding this closing the loops through keeping a log of what you've done, maybe keeping a log of the skills that you applied or learned as you did that difficult thing, and the strengths that you use is also really, really useful. I'm going to come on now to the last of those myths and misconceptions. So it's kind of our cross to bear. It's our fault if we're thinking about ourselves in this way. It's our syndrome, okay? And also it's linked to that is is the idea that actually it's not us at all. It's actually caused by oppression. So let's have a look at the first one. And there's some fantastic work by Toshan and Jodie Ann Burry as well. And their article that appeared in the Harvard Business Review last year is still in the top 100 most read articles for Harvard Business Review. And it really was a game changer in the way that we looked at imposter syndrome, okay? So actually there is this idea about, is this really all about us and the way we think about ourselves in our own headspace, or is this actually the result of systemic bias and inclusion and much more exclusion, sorry, and much more to do with the system in which we are operating within, okay? So feeling like an outsider, feeling like a fraud, feeling like you're not being accepted actually isn't an illusion, okay, a lot of the time. It's actually, for many women, a reality of the environment in which they are working within. And I wonder whether any of you have experienced that. And these don't have to be really obvious biases as well. Like systemic bias is often really subtle, often really about cultural norms, about unconscious biases that are sort of little microaggressions. So when you go against those cultural norms, then people respond very subtly in little ways that you didn't realize, but you pick up on. So someone who's saying in chat, definitely, absolutely. And I don't think this is a deliberate thing either. I don't think that this is something deliberate that people are trying to do, but it's very much part of the system. I'll give you an example, okay? So last year, I was the lead facilitator on a senior leaders program in the manufacturing sector. And it's not an area that I've worked in a lot. And on the course, they were all men. So, and this was a nice little thing for my imposter phenomenon to come up and start questioning whether I had anything of value to offer. But actually, I dealt with all of that in terms of my own headspace. That was fine. But what was interesting is that I showed up in my usual facilitator style of being very accommodating and very nice to people. And actually, I think that it was misunderstood by a lot of the men there as me wanting to be of service to them. So actually, I think quite quickly, rather than that, there was a different way in which they were treating the male facilitators on that program and on other programs compared to the way they were treating me. And it became a little bit more like they were expecting me to do things for them rather than seeing me as being the expert in the room. Okay. So that was really interesting. They were lovely people as well. It wasn't something that they would have wanted to have done. It was just that subtle sort of stereotype, that subtle kind of understanding of this is where I see women usually within the culture within my organization. Okay. So what do we do then if we are working in a broken system? Okay, and actually then what the authors of that article would say, the system's not broken. It's actually working. It's working exactly the way it was designed. Okay, and that in itself is really interesting, isn't it? It's not broken. It's actually serving some people incredibly well, and that there is really very little incentive to change that. So I think we have to kind of think about the impact of this female syndrome, you know, and what's even I even questioned the title of the session in the end. I was thinking we shouldn't even be talking about this thing anymore in simplistic terms. We should really be talking about this and really trying to understand it systemically and where it comes from, and trying to challenge it a lot more rather than identifying with it. And that in itself isn't easy either. I appreciate that, but there's definitely a bigger context we need to consider it in. We need to also recognize that bias does exist in our societies and in our workplaces. We've made some really big strides as women, I think, but not so much. I think the experience of women from different cultures and different ethnic backgrounds, different races is quite different still, then that's what the research has shown from Jodie Ann Burry. And actually it is quite often difficult to be heard and to position yourself in a way that works within the system. Women are often more harshly judged than men in the workplace as leaders, and we know that from the research as well. They're expected to be strong and sensitive, whereas men are just expected to be strong as leaders, and that's really difficult, isn't it? Like, so when have I got to be strong? When have I got to be sensitive? How do I show up here? That's really hard. And we know that microaggressions are a reality, okay? And as I said earlier, real experiences from Black women and women from ethnic minorities. This isn't an imagined condition by any stretch of the imagination, okay? So what do we do about it then? Because I don't like the sound of this, and I'm sure I can see you all horrible, shocked faces in the chat. No, I don't like this at all. So, and we can say, you know, this isn't right, and it's not our responsibility either. This isn't our doing. But actually, scarily, we are also the victim of unconscious bias in the way we see ourselves. Okay, so it's not just the way we're seen, but the way we see ourselves. If we're not careful, we can start to put ourselves into boxes, and we can start to undermine ourselves because of the stereotypes we have. We don't have so many female role models, so many female mentors, and we are operating in a system where that is harder for us to identify with. Sorry, I realised I hadn't actually been building that slide at all. So there we go. Just give you a minute to flick through and check that you've got that. So what do we do? I'll go back to my example then on that senior leaders program with that really nice group of men who didn't intend that in that way at all, but was very much, we slipped into those roles within that system. I got the fire in my belly, okay? I thought, I can understand where this is coming from, but I really don't like it. And I started thinking about my sense of purpose in terms of flying the flag for myself and for other female leaders. And I thought, you know, I need to change this. This needs to be addressed. And I became much more assertive. And I started to apply some of the techniques that I know and use around being heard. Okay, so I thought, you know, this is going to have to be addressed and changed. And I adapted my own behaviours accordingly. And we did also actually address it in the session as well, talking about microaggressions and unconscious bias. And I put it to them, how did they see me as being the lead facilitator on their senior leadership program when they don't tend to see that within their own workplaces? Okay, that was absolutely fascinating. So there we go. That would really link in with that top one, I think. What can we do? If you are still quite externally motivated, then please think about what you need to do in a situation for other people. Okay, so you know how you can act in a committed way despite the imposter phenomenon, despite the voice in your head, so that you're actually doing it for other people rather than doing it for yourself, because we do need to change that system and that script. Practically, I always, when I'm coaching other people on this kind of thing, I talk about planning a strategy for your own behavior. So you will already have a strategy, a way of behaving when imposter syndrome shows up. We saw that some people procrastinate and then they overwork at the last minute, okay? And that has like a self-sabotaging loop to it as well, because then if something goes wrong, you say, well, that's because I didn't work hard enough. And if something goes right, you say, but next time I'll be caught out because I didn't do enough work. So, you know, we've got strategies and often they don't work for us. So we want to plan a new strategy for our behavior in certain situations. And sometimes that comes down to using tactics to be heard. So often women talk to me in particular, but not just women, talk to me about being interrupted in meetings, or not when they go to say something, people talk over the top of them. So tactics whereby we know that if we take up a lot more space in the room, that we sit in an alpha stance or power pose, as Amy Cuddy would call it, that people start to see us in a different way, and we actually start to see ourselves in a different way. So poses where we take up space, you can't see what I'm doing, but I've got my hands on my hips and I've got my legs slightly apart, are I'm in the room and I'm here, okay? When you want to speak, to lean forward as you're speaking, and your opening words need to be pretty loud, okay? The other thing is to make some adaptations to what you're saying. So depressingly, we know that a lot of senior teams still have people in them who have quite strong thinking preferences. So they talk about facts, figures, data, evidence quite a lot, and they don't have so much of a feelings preference. And we also know the majority of women, 65% roughly, have that feelings preference. So we talk about how we feel, we talk about the impact on other people, we talk about their feelings, and that is not easy data to be heard when someone else has a stronger preference otherwise. So as depressing as I find this, sometimes we need to think about how we say the message, rather so that we are tapping into that data, evidence, thinking preference more than our usual starting point, okay? And finally, please make sure that you share the evidence of your success. Even if the imposter voice is loud, just make sure that you ease into the discomfort and tell people what you did and how well it went, okay? And they are my tips. The other thing is about not wearing imposter syndrome as a bit of a badge of honor. And I might have got this really wrong, but I see at the moment almost like if you're a high achieving female, then this is the female way of being allowed to be high achieving. Oh yeah, but I really doubt myself. I have these crippling insecurities as well. And I don't doubt for some people that is absolutely the case, but I felt quite uneasy when I was going through designing this session and finding out more, because I thought, do I sometimes say that I've got this imposter phenomenon when in actual fact, I just got healthy levels of self-doubt. And actually owning our own performance for ourselves and other people is really important and certainly essential if we're going to challenge the system, to change the system that we operate within. So yeah, this idea that all these high-performing women saying, oh, I suffered from imposter syndrome. In actual fact, maybe you have, but does it mean that that's the only way or the main way that we get to be high achieving? As I was designing this session, I sat with my daughter. She's just going to go to university to study applied psychology. She had some pre-work to do, and she was reading an article that was in the Mirror that was saying that that parents shouldn't express negative emotions to their children because that causes them to have self-doubt that can lead to depression. She was being asked to say whether she thought that was a valid article with valid sources, or and then offer her own opinions. So we both agreed it was complete rubbish, the article, and very poorly written, and with very little evidence base. But we had a wider conversation about what our opinions were on it, and we agreed that even though vulnerability is really important, okay, because it's part of humanity, it's part of and it's part of who we are to be vulnerable, particularly if we care about things, and it's definitely part of leadership as well. This whole idea of putting ourselves down and making negative comparisons to other people all the time, particularly as women, particularly as mothers, I think it really does, and she agreed with me, we really need to stop doing that, actually. We should be able to say, I absolutely love what I do, and actually I'm really good at it, without feeling any negative feelings, or without feeling that it makes us arrogant or makes us sound like something we shouldn't sound like within the system we operate within. And I think it's really important that she hears me say that more, rather than saying about the times when I had that doubt about myself. So there we go. That's my kind of thing, is all of the stuff that I've read, everything that I'm sort of shared with you, to buck the system and find your own voice. And it's going to be difficult, but I have every faith that we'll all be able to do that. And